Hey guys, tonight we begin with an image you might never forget. Anne Boleyn clutching her large, pregnant belly, collapsing in heartbreaking sobs, while King Henry VIII, once seen as unshakable, stands beside her trembling, his eyes red and swollen as if he too has just lost something he could never reclaim. But what makes that moment haunting is not only the tears, it is the truth that if just one breath had gone differently, one heartbeat slowed, or one piece of news arrived only a few minutes later, the entire fate of the two most powerful people in England might have turned in a completely different direction. There are nights when, looking back at old stories, we realize that tragedy does not always come from an enemy. Sometimes it begins with the smallest, most unexpected, accidental things no one could foresee, yet powerful enough to bury an entire dynasty. In tonight's video, I want to tell you a journey few people dare to speak fully. How a single piece of devastating news in a palace corridor could stop a heartbeat, end the life of a child who never had a chance, and push a queen toward losing everything in just a few short weeks. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, I'd love to know more about you. Where are you watching from? And what time is it where you live right now? Feel free to leave a comment. I read every single one. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Late in the month of January of the year 1536, while England was wrapped in mourning for the death of Catherine of Aragon, another kind of darkness was beginning to gather, quieter, more private, and far more devastating. The kingdom's attention was fixed on the solemn ceremonies honouring the first wife of King Henry VIII, a woman who had once been beloved by the people and who, even in death, cast a long shadow over the court. Yet within the walls of Greenwich Palace, a tragedy of an entirely different nature was quietly taking shape. There, Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, mother of a tiny princess, and now carrying a child of roughly 5 months, held within her the last fragile hope that might secure her future. A living son could steady the trembling ground beneath her feet, calm the storms of political hostility rising against her, and preserve her place beside the king. Everything depended on this child, her safety, her influence, her survival. And so, through those winter days, she moved carefully, protecting the life inside her like a flame cupped between trembling hands. But on that fateful afternoon, Henry VIII, then 44 years old, chose once again to wrap himself in the image he loved most, that of the warrior king. Despite the cold, despite the strain of age and injury accumulated from years of sport, he entered a winter joust with the confidence of a younger man. Perhaps he wished to silence whispers that he was slowing down. Perhaps he wished to prove to himself that he was still the same Henry who had dazzled Europe 2 decades earlier. Whatever the reason, his decision led directly into catastrophe. In the midst of the match, his opponent's lance struck him with brutal force. The blow toppled both the king and his armoured horse, sending them crashing into the frozen ground. Witnesses later recalled the sound of impact, a sickening metallic thud, and then a silence so complete it felt unnatural. Henry lay motionless, encased in his heavy armour, offering no sign of breath, no twitch of movement, no answer to the cries of his attendants. Nearly 2 hours passed, long, terrifying hours in which the king's body remained still, his face pale beneath the visor. Those who surrounded him, grooms, guards, physicians, found themselves paralyzed by fear. Removing the armor might worsen unseen injuries. Leaving it on might cost him his life. No one dared act, for the consequences of harming the king, even unintentionally, were unthinkable. And so they hovered, helpless, waiting for a miracle or a final breath, whichever came first. Inside the palace, the news spread like fire catching dry straw. The king is dying. Whispers echoed across stone corridors, swelling with panic. The implications unfurled instantly in every mind. Henry VIII had no legitimate male heir. Princess Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, was only 3 years old. Lady Mary, declared illegitimate after her mother's marriage was annulled, would not be accepted by many nobles. Half the realm despised Anne Boleyn and viewed her as the cause of England's religious upheaval. If Henry died, the succession would shatter into chaos. Civil war seemed not only possible, but imminent. Those fears seeped into every corner of the palace, filling the winter air with dread. And then, in her private chamber, the Queen heard the words that froze her blood. Henry, her husband, her protector, the man whose power shielded her from every enemy, might already be dead. The shock struck her with such force that she felt a sharp, twisting pain deep in her abdomen. It was sudden, overwhelming, and unmistakably wrong. That pain, the first crack in the fragile shield around her unborn child, would soon widen into a tragedy that could not be undone. In that single moment, Anne's world shifted. The future she had fought for, the title she had endured hatred for, the child she carried as her last defense began slipping away like sand through open fingers. She could not yet know it, but the fall of Henry VIII in that icy jousting yard had opened a door through which her own fate would soon be pushed. The king's collapse was the first echo of a greater disaster, the moment that set her on a path leading not to triumph, but to a scaffold. And though she continued to breathe, to hope, to pray, something in her life had already begun to die the instant Henry struck the ground. When Henry lay motionless, the entire court entered a kind of dreadful suspension, a hush so deep it felt as though even the walls were holding their breath. No one dared speak above a whisper. No one dared move too quickly. In Tudor England, a single misinterpreted message, one careless word, could alter the balance of power in the span of a heartbeat. And now the King Henry VIII himself was stretched upon the frozen ground, silent, unresponsive, offering no assurance that life still pulsed within him. The physicians who gathered around him were paralyzed. They could not determine whether his spine had been fractured, whether his organs had been crushed beneath the weight of armor and horse, or whether unseen internal bleeding was quietly stealing his life away. His armor, heavy and rigid, protected and endangered him at the same time. Removing it might worsen a hidden injury. Leaving it could suffocate him. They hovered in a miserable circle, trapped by uncertainty, each man silently praying that the next breath Henry drew would be audible, visible, anything that could be called proof that England still had a king. Yet in another part of the palace, the fear was of an entirely different nature. For Anne Boleyn, the news of the king's collapse was not merely a political earthquake, it was a personal devastation. When the words reached her words saying that Henry had been crushed beneath his armoured horse, that he lay insensible and might die before nightfall, a coldness swept through her body like winter wind passing straight through bone. She was carrying a child, nearly 5 months along, the child who was meant to be her protection against every enemy. And in that moment she understood with chilling clarity that everything, her safety, her honour, her very life, rested upon Henry continuing to breathe. In the Tudor world, a woman's fate was tethered to the life of the man who protected her, and Anne had fewer protectors than most queens before her. Half the kingdom despised her. Powerful families like the Howards, despite being her blood, would discard her in an instant if it served their survival. And those who longed to see Lady Mary restored would seize any opportunity to remove the woman they blamed for England's religious upheaval. Without Henry, Anne would have no shield, no allies, no son to secure her position. She would be exposed to every blade sharpened against her. As minutes passed with no word from the jousting yard, her fear grew into something sharp, breathless, almost unbearable. Each second of silence felt like a blow. She understood far better than her enemies ever imagined. If Henry died, she would not simply fall from favour, she would be erased. Elsewhere in the palace, panic blossomed. Courtiers hurried through corridors, boots striking stone with frantic rhythm. Foreign ambassadors reached for ink and parchment, their hands trembling as they wrote secret reports warning their masters of an impending succession crisis. Servants wept openly, unsure whether they were mourning already or only rehearsing for the morning to come. And through all of it, one figure drew more attention than any other: Jane Seymour. Gentle, quiet Jane, who never contradicted, never argued, never sought influence. Now, because Henry had shown interest in her, she became the silent centre of a growing storm. People watched her closely not because she had acted, but because she had not. Her stillness, her modesty, her lack of ambition made her suddenly luminous in the eyes of those who believed Anne had overreached. 2 full hours passed before the miracle finally came. Henry stirred. A ragged cough rattled through the metal of his helmet. Blood stained his lips, but he was alive. And with that single motion, small, painful, but unmistakable, the palace exhaled as one. Someone shouted for water. Someone else dropped to his knees in grateful prayer. The terror of civil war retreated, at least for the moment. But for Anne, the worst had not yet come. Henry's injury, though he survived it, was severe. The blow to his head would alter him permanently, darkening his temper, sharpening his suspicion, eroding what gentleness remained in him. The man who rose again from that fall was not quite the man who had mounted the horse earlier that afternoon. And 5 days later, in the shadow of that fear, with her nerves frayed and her body trembling under the weight of shock, the child Anne carried a boy would be lost. On the 29th day of January, in the year 1536, as Catherine of Aragon was laid to rest, Anne Boleyn began to miscarry. The cruel timing chilled the court to its core. While the former wife of Henry was being lowered into her grave, the current wife was losing her final hope. Anne was only about 15 weeks into her pregnancy, far enough that the child's sex could be recognized, but not far enough for him to survive. The pain came suddenly, sharply, nothing like the light discomfort she had carried in the early weeks. It was deeper, harsher, an unmistakable tearing of something meant to remain whole. Midwives rushed to her side, their footsteps thin against the cold stone floor. Physicians arrived moments later, their brows already tight with dread. Everyone present understood the gravity of this moment long before the child slipped into the world. They knew this was not merely a loss of blood or flesh. This was the collapse of a future that had been holding Anne's world together. When the tiny body emerged small, complete, unmistakably male, it was wrapped in a plain white cloth without ceremony. The room fell into a silence so dense it seemed to smother the air itself. No one looked Anne in the eyes. No one whispered comfort. No one dared to speak the truth that hovered in the atmosphere like a ghost. It is a boy. They knew exactly what this meant. This little prince, who never breathed, had been Anne Boleyn's last shield. The final barrier between her and the hunters who had long circled her throne with patient, sharpened intent. With him gone, every door that once protected her had quietly swung open. When the news reached Henry, he neither wept nor prayed nor held his wife. Instead, he delivered a sentence that fell heavier than any blow. God does not give me sons. Not us. Not our child. Only me, as if Anne had never been part of the story at all. That single word carved the divide cleanly. In Henry's mind, a marriage that failed to produce a living male heir was not misfortune. It was divine judgment. Catherine had been condemned by the same logic. Now it wrapped its cold fingers around Anne. Weak and trembling, Anne tried to explain. She told Henry that the shock of believing he had been crushed beneath his armoured horse had torn through her like a blade, that her body had responded with terror, not failure. She spoke through tears, through pain that throbbed deeper than flesh. It was the truth, and everyone in the chamber knew it. But Henry did not want truth. Henry wanted a son. And at that exact moment, another figure quietly stepped into the path Henry now searched for. Jane Seymour. Gentle, silent, uncomplicated. A woman whose body had not yet disappointed him, whose history did not challenge him, whose presence did not remind him of battles fought and promises broken. Jane became possibility. Anne felt that shift like a cold wind passing through her bones. She had lost her child, a son who might have secured her crown. And with him, she had lost Henry's gaze, Henry's warmth, Henry's will to protect her. His heart was moving elsewhere, and with it went every safeguard she had ever possessed. In the quiet hours that followed the miscarriage, Anne lay still, listening to the muted sounds of the palace around her. Nothing had changed outwardly. She was still queen, still draped in velvet and authority. But she could feel the truth settling over her like winter frost. Henry's love had begun to crumble, and when that foundation fell, everything else would follow. And in Tudor England, when a king's affection died, a queen's life was measured not in years, but in days. After Anne's miscarriage, the world around her shifted with a quiet but devastating force, as though every corridor of the palace had been waiting for this single moment to breathe out its cruelty. Malicious whispers floated through the tapestries and stone arches. Rumours claiming the child had been deformed. Rumours insisting it was a sign of divine punishment. Rumours that the marriage between Anne and Henry had never been blessed by heaven at all. None of it was true. The boy she lost had been perfectly formed. But in the Tudor world, lies that served a purpose spread faster than truth ever could. and this lie was far too useful to be resisted by the faction that longed to see Anne fall and Jane Seymour rise. In Tudor England, a queen's worth was narrowed down to one function: to produce a living male heir. A daughter could be loved, a daughter could be cherished, but a daughter could not secure a dynasty. Anne had now lost 2 pregnancies, and though neither loss was rooted in sin or fault, enemies seized upon the pattern with savage delight, claiming that God himself had rejected her. The same accusations that once crushed Catherine of Aragon were now being sharpened again, pointed directly at Anne's already wounded heart. At the same time, Henry, barely recovered from the terrible jousting accident, seemed to unravel in ways that no one dared say aloud. The blow to his head, severe enough to change a lesser man entirely, had left subtle fractures in his mind. He grew quicker to anger, more suspicious, more inclined towards superstition. The sharp wit that once captivated him in Anne, the intelligence that once drew him like a moth toward flame, now struck him as resistance, defiance, insolence. He no longer yearned for a brilliant partner. He yearned for silent obedience and a son. And in the quiet spaces of the palace, another transformation was unfolding. Thomas Cromwell, the man who had once helped lift Anne from mistress to queen, felt his place slipping, thread by fragile thread. He had already been wounded by the sermon of John Skip, Anne's chaplain, who had suggested Cromwell resembled Haman, the biblical villain who plotted against Queen Esther. It was not merely an insult, it was a declaration of political war. Cromwell was not a man who entered battles he could not win, and he sensed the shift in Henry's affections with frightening clarity. He saw the coldness in Henry's gaze when he looked at Anne. He watched as Jane Seymour was escorted into finer chambers, as she became the quiet centre of a gathering storm. He smelled the change in the air, the way a sailor smells rain hours before the clouds appear. So Cromwell began to turn away from Anne, not with dramatic gestures, but with small, deliberate, deadly calculations. A withdrawn word here, a withheld protection there, a subtle nod to those who wished for Anne's collapse. In a world built on fragile alliances, silence itself was a weapon. Across the kingdom, the old Catholic families watched Anne's decline with barely veiled triumph. To them, she had been the force that tore England away from Rome, the woman bold enough to fracture a centuries-old order. Now, as she weakened, they thrilled at the idea that the instability she embodied might finally be purged. Their prayers were not for mercy but for restoration, and every misfortune that touched Anne seemed to them like confirmation that God was correcting a cosmic mistake. All the while, allies grew scarce. Doors once open to her now closed with soft, decisive clicks. Courtiers who once bowed with deep respect now measured their gestures, cautious of being seen too close to a sinking star. Even Henry, who just months before had adored her with an intensity bordering on obsession, moved through the palace like a man already living in another future one, where Anne Boleyn no longer stood at his side. Isolation gathered around her slowly at first, then swiftly, tightening like a noose with each passing hour. She felt it in the quiet glances exchanged behind her back, in the forced smiles, in the sudden emptiness of rooms that once buzzed with attention when she entered. The death of her baby was not merely a tragedy. It was a signal, a flare in the night sky that told her enemies their moment had arrived. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and the exhaustion, Anne knew it too. The child she lost had been more than a son. He had been her last protection, and with his passing, a tide she could not stop had begun to rise, slowly, silently, ready to sweep away everything she had fought to build. After the funeral of Catherine and the miscarriage that shattered what little hope remained, Cromwell understood a single, merciless truth. Henry wanted out of this marriage, and Cromwell would either be the man who delivered that escape, or he would fall with Anne. So he began his work in silence, moving like a shadow through corridors already thick with tension. He gathered every harmless whisper ever spoken about Anne, her cheerful manner, her quick wit with male courtiers, her lively conversations, the very charm that once made Henry love her. In Cromwell's hands, these trivial things softened into something darker, reshaped into signs of adultery, threads of wrongdoing to be woven into a noose. His first target was Mark Smeaton, the young musician whose low birth made him vulnerable, pliable, easily crushed. Smeaton was summoned to Cromwell's house, and whatever happened behind those closed doors changed him forever. Some said he was tortured, others believed threats alone broke him. But when he finally emerged, trembling, hollow, he carried a confession that would become the cornerstone of Anne's destruction. He said he had been intimate with the Queen. That single lie, pressed out of him like blood squeezed from a wound, opened the gate for Cromwell to pull more men into the trap. He seized Henry Norris, the King's trusted companion. Then Francis Weston, the young nobleman whose name had never been linked with scandal. Then William Brereton, powerful and feared in the Welsh marches. And at last, George Boleyn, Anne's devoted brother, whose loyalty had never once wavered. The accusations were monstrous. Adultery, treason, plotting the king's death, even incest. Cromwell did not need evidence. He needed only a story that fit neatly into Henry's wounded pride and deepening superstition. And Henry, shaken by grief, shaken by rage, shaken by the head injury that haunted his every waking hour, believed the story instantly. To him, it explained everything. It placed the blame neatly into Anne's hands. It justified the hollow ache of disappointment that had followed him for months. On the 2nd day of May, Anne was watching a tennis match when she was summoned abruptly. No warning, no preparation, no time to gather strength. Norfolk, her own uncle, stood before her, his face a mask of authority that barely hid fear. He recited the charges with a flat voice, as though listing market goods, not the supposed sins of his niece. And when Anne heard the names of the men arrested, Smeaton, Norris, Weston, Brereton, and finally George, her breath seemed to leave her entirely. She broke down then, stunned by the cruelty of it. Shock and disbelief twisted together inside her like a tightening rope. She cried out, unable to understand how God could allow such a turn, how those she knew so well could be accused of such things, how fate could unravel so quickly. The walls spun. The floor trembled. Her world was collapsing in real time. By late afternoon, soldiers escorted her to the river. A small barge waited the same route she had taken 3 years earlier, when she journeyed to the Tower as a queen to be crowned. Then, the riverbanks had been lined with cheering crowds, music and banners rippling like golden flames. Now, the water was silent. The oars dipped soft and slow. No one smiled. No one bowed. No one dared meet her eyes. As the boat drifted toward the looming white stones of the tower, a cold realization seeped into her bones. She was not being taken there as a queen, but as a condemned woman. When she stepped onto the same queen's stairs where she once arrived triumphant, the air around her felt heavier, as if the tower itself recognized her return and mourned it. 17 days. That was all she had left. 17 nights in the rooms where she once dreamed of glory. 17 dawns to understand that every moment of her rise had been mirrored by a path leading quietly, steadily, toward this fall. The trap Cromwell built had closed completely now. There was no escape. The woman who had once held the attention of a king, who once commanded a kingdom with her smile, now found herself caged within the same walls that had once celebrated her reign. And as the heavy doors shut behind her, Anne felt the weight of the truth settle like winter frost. Her story was ending, and the world had already begun preparing to forget her. After Anne was imprisoned in the Tower, Cromwell's legal machinery began to move with the slow, merciless certainty of a blade being sharpened in the dark. What awaited her was not a fair inquiry, nor an honest search for truth, but a construction, a carefully crafted horror tale dressed up as law. The indictment written against her read less like a legal document and more like something designed to provoke disgust, revulsion, and unquestioning fear. She was accused of adultery with 5 men. She was accused of incest with her brother, George Boleyn. She was accused of conspiring to murder the king himself. Every line was laced with language meant to soil her reputation before she ever opened her mouth to speak. Dates were listed. Hours were specified. Places were named with the precision of someone who wished to appear diligent. It was all written so neatly, so confidently, so convincingly that it felt almost airtight. But years later, when historians studied court records, household accounts, royal expense books, and the travel logs of courtiers, a chilling truth emerged. On many of the dates listed, Anne was nowhere near the locations where the alleged crimes supposedly happened. and the men accused with her were often recorded in entirely different places, some miles away, some on royal business, some simply elsewhere in the palace under strict supervision. The timelines did not match. The logistics did not match. Reality did not match. But none of that mattered. Tudor justice did not run on fact. It ran on the will of the king. At the heart of the indictment stood the tortured confession of Mark Smeaton, the musician whose spirit had been broken in Cromwell's house. Whether through pain, fear, or promises of mercy, he had uttered the words Cromwell needed. And once he confessed, even falsely, the rest of the accusations were easy to stack like brittle wood waiting to be set alight. The others, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, denied every charge, even when offered the chance to save their lives in exchange for a false admission. They held their ground until the very end, but in Tudor England, truth spoken without power had no weight. George Boleyn's case was more grotesque still. His closeness with his sister, shared jokes, private conversations, the easy affection of siblings was twisted into something obscene. Cromwell and his circle painted intimacy as corruption, loyalty as depravity, and during George's trial, they produced a small folded piece of paper. It contained words no subject should ever repeat, words that whispered of the king's impotence, words that hinted that Elizabeth might not be Henry's child. George was told not to read it aloud, but whether from shock, defiance, or a momentary lapse, he did. And with those words, he sealed his own fate. Exposing the king's weakness, even by accident, was unforgivable. All of these threads, some false, some distorted, some invented outright, wove themselves together into the final spectacle. Anne's great trial on the 15th day of May. She stood in black velvet, her figure small yet unbroken, before 27 noblemen. In theory, they were her equals. In truth, they were executioners wearing fine gowns and jewelled collars. Her uncle Norfolk presided, his voice steady, his eyes cold, his loyalty shifted entirely to the king. Anne spoke with clarity, grace, and intelligence. Witnesses later whispered that she answered every charge so logically, so cleanly, that many believed she had proven herself innocent. Her words were calm, measured, shaped with the kind of quiet strength that comes from knowing one's heart is clean, even if the world refuses to see it. She did not break. She did not plead. She did not crumble. In that courtroom, she was still a queen, but the verdict had been decided long before she entered the hall. Every man nodded in agreement. Every voice delivered the same answer. Guilty. All charges. Without hesitation, without doubt, without mercy. In the Tudor world, truth bent under the weight of royal desire. And Henry, wounded in pride, haunted by superstition, hungry for certainty and a male heir, had already chosen the path. The trial was merely a performance, one last illusion of justice before the real punishment began. And as Anne was escorted back to her rooms in the Tower, the knowledge settled over her like a heavy, quiet fog. Innocence had no power here. The king had spoken in silence long before the court spoke aloud. Her fate had been sealed not by evidence, but by the heart of a man who no longer wished her to live. The rooms where Anne was held in the Tower of London were not damp dungeons, nor dark stone chambers meant for criminals. They were the very same royal apartments she had lived in 3 years earlier, just before her coronation. Tapestries still hung on the walls. The windows were still set with leaded glass. The bed was still soft, draped in fine fabrics. The furniture, carved and polished, still belonged to a queen. Yet now, all of it had transformed into a gilded prison. And perhaps that was the cruelest part. Every corner whispered of what she had once been. Every familiar detail pressed against her like a memory-turned weapon. The window where she had once stood, waving to crowds that cheered her name, now faced directly onto Tower Green, where a scaffold was being constructed plank by plank. She could see the workers lifting beams, hear the dull, rhythmic thud of hammers, feel each strike as though it tapped against her ribs. The bed where she had once lain awake, too excited to sleep on the eve of becoming queen, now kept her restless for a different reason. She counted the nights left to her, each one thinner than the last, each dawn a reminder that her life was slipping quietly away. Cromwell had arranged for 4 women to attend her, though attend was not the right word. They were not her dear ladies, not those who loved her or understood her. They were chosen specifically to observe, to listen, to remember. There was Mistress Coffin, Mistress Stoner, Lady Boleyn, her distant aunt, cold and stiff, and Lady Kingston. They were companions in appearance, jailers in truth. Every tear Anne shed, every forced laugh, every whispered question about her father or her brother George, every tremble in her voice when she wondered aloud what might become of the men arrested with her. Every word was carried to Sir William Kingston, and from him straight to Cromwell. Anne spoke often, sometimes softly, sometimes hurriedly, as if the words were trying to hold her together. She insisted on her innocence. She asked whether Henry truly believed these accusations, whether he had forgotten the years he had pursued her, the vows he had sworn, the kingdom he had torn apart for her sake. She wondered how a man who had once said he loved her more than life itself could now abandon her so completely. At night, she listened to the tower breathe around her. The footsteps of guards changing shift, the distant lap of the Thames against the stone walls, the faint, pained cries from prisoners held in the lower cells, real prisoners, not queens in velvet, chaw-lined captivity. The sounds seeped beneath her door and wrapped themselves around her thoughts. No matter how soft her bed or how fine her chambers, she understood the truth. She was no different from them. She too was waiting for death. Outside, the scaffold grew higher. She could not see its full form yet, but she could see the shape it was becoming. A quiet, wooden clock, counting down her final days, her final hours. With each rising beam, with each thud of a hammer, the future narrowed into something sharp and certain. By then, Anne knew the trial ahead of her was a performance, not a possibility. The verdict had been written long before she would stand before the peers of England. It had been written the moment her child, the son who might have saved her, left her body lifeless and still. That was the hour Henry's heart closed. That was the hour Cromwell began sharpening his knives. That was the hour her crown became a burden too heavy to bear. She was living only on borrowed time now, and she felt it in every breath. The 15th day of May arrived heavy and airless, as though even the sky understood what was about to unfold. Nearly 2,000 people crowded into the great hall of the tower, squeezing shoulder to shoulder, their breath caught between morbid curiosity and the thrill of witnessing a queen brought low. Officially, they had come to hear Anne Boleyn defend herself against accusations of adultery, incest, and treason. In truth, they had come to watch a woman who had already been condemned deliver her final lines before the blade claimed her. Anne entered dressed in black velvet, moving with a calmness that unsettled even those who despised her. Her face was composed, unreadable, as if she had already stepped into another realm where the noise of the world could no longer reach. In front of her sat 27 noblemen, men who in theory were her equals, but in practice were the instruments of her destruction. Among them was her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, presiding over the trial, his expression stiff, hiding fear behind authority. Once, his family had risen because of her. Now, he was here to help bury her. Near him sat Henry Percy, the man who had once loved her deeply, who had once nearly married her. He looked pale, hollow, as though the very sight of her standing accused drained the blood from his body. He had no power to save her. He was simply another witness to the unravelling of a life he once imagined, joined with his own. The indictment was read aloud, long, vulgar, dripping with imagery meant to sicken the stomach rather than convince the mind. The accusations were repeated with theatrical disgust. Illicit trysts in private chambers, whispered plots to poison the king, promises to marry her supposed lovers once Henry was dead. The goal was not truth. It was corrosion. It was to rot her image from the inside out, to ensure that by the time judgment came, no one would dare defend her. When her turn came to speak, Anne did not weep. She did not rage. Her voice, when it rose in the echoing hall, was steady, almost gentle. She answered each charge with clarity, acknowledging only that she had once given money to Francis Weston, something she had done for many young courtiers, an act of patronage twisted into sin. Everything else, every sordid detail, every fabricated meeting, every imagined betrayal she denied with dignity and lucidity. Those who watched her closely later wrote that she spoke so wisely and distinctly as though she had never been accused of anything at all. In a world governed by fairness, her words might have pierced the fog of lies. They might have loosened the net that had been cast around her. But England was not governed by fairness. England was governed by Henry VIII. 4 men had already been convicted of adultery with her. To declare her innocent would mean admitting the king had erred, that the previous trials were unjust, that Cromwell had manipulated the crown, that the machinery of the realm had crushed innocent men. No peer in that hall was willing to challenge the king's will. No one dared lift a hand against the shadow Henry cast. One by one, in a rhythm as cold as winter rain, all 27 noblemen pronounced her guilty. Then Norfolk stood. Some said his tears were real. Others whispered they were crafted for effect, meant to show reluctance where none existed. His voice trembled slightly as he delivered the sentence that Anne would either be burned alive within the tower walls or beheaded, depending on what the king decided. Anne did not beg. She did not fall to her knees. She simply lifted her chin slightly, as though bracing herself against an invisible wind, and spoke the only words she could afford to say. She believed she was condemned, for some other reason, not for the crimes listed. The hall fell silent, as if the very stones held their breath. Everyone present understood the meaning beneath her words. They understood the truth she dared not name outright. But no one answered her. No one could. 2 days after the trial, on the morning of the 17th day of May, the 5 men condemned alongside Anne were taken to the scaffold at Tower Hill. The air was cold, the sky dim. Some said Anne could hear the distant murmurs of the gathered crowd from her rooms in the tower. Others believed someone whispered the news to her. Either way, she knew what was happening. She knew they were dying for a story Cromwell had already written, a tragedy arranged long before any of them set foot on the platform. George Boleyn, her brother, was brought out first, as he held the highest rank among them. He walked with a calm dignity that broke the hearts of those who still believed in justice. Standing on the damp wooden planks, George delivered a speech that resembled a sermon more than a farewell. He acknowledged himself as a sinner before God, but then added that if he had truly lived according to the fullness of God's word, he would not be standing there. It was his way of declaring his innocence without directly rebuking the king, an act of courage veiled in humility. Moments later, the axe fell, ending the life of the man who had been Anne's closest companion, her equal in wit and loyalty. Next came Henry Norris, once the king's most trusted friend. He had been offered mercy if he would confess, but he refused. He chose silence, choosing to die with his honor intact rather than speak a lie that would grant him a few more breaths. He stepped forward quietly, knelt, and was gone in a single stroke, leaving behind only unanswered questions and a friendship Henry would never speak of again. Francis Weston followed. Young, wealthy, respected, his life should have stretched out long before him, full of promise. Instead, he stood trembling on the scaffold, offering what little he could to those watching below. A simple plea that they learn from his example, though he himself did not understand what crime he had supposedly committed. His only sin had been existing near a queen whom the king no longer wanted. William Brereton came next, a powerful political figure whose influence had made him inconvenient to many. He admitted that he was worthy of 1,000 deaths, but then added a haunting request, that the crowd should not judge the true cause for which he died. The words echoed eerily through the square, mirroring what Anne had said in her own trial. Everyone knew what he meant. The charges were a curtain. The real reasons lay hidden in the rooms where power whispered. Last was Mark Smeaton, the musician whose coerced confession had set the entire tragedy in motion. He was pale, exhausted, hollowed out by fear, and whatever had been done to him behind Cromwell's doors. Standing on the platform, he did not retract his confession. He did not declare Anne innocent. Perhaps terror sealed his tongue. Perhaps he believed that recanting would damn him further. Or perhaps he was simply too broken to speak against the words he had already uttered. When Anne learned that Smeaton had remained silent, she whispered through tears, "I fear his soul will suffer for it." She understood better than anyone the weight of a lie carried beyond the grave, the pain of a truth buried in darkness. The punishment was not merely physical. It followed the heart, the soul, into the life beyond. One by one, 5 men died. Their bodies were carried away. Their names were crossed out. Their voices were extinguished. And with them removed like pieces cleared from a stage, it became unmistakably clear who would be next. The Queen. At dawn on the 19th day of May in the year 1536, Anne Boleyn awoke at 2 in the morning. She knew with a still, heavy certainty that this was the final day of her life. She confessed her sins, took communion, and swore on the salvation of her soul that she was innocent. In Tudor belief, such an oath was not taken lightly. To lie under it was to condemn oneself to eternal damnation. She would not have spoken falsely, not when her soul was all she had left. Her execution had been set for 8 o'clock, but the hour slipped by. The scaffold was not yet ready. The 200 carefully chosen spectators had not yet gathered. Because she was a queen, her death would not take place before the common crowds. Instead, it would unfold within the controlled, manicured space of Tower Green, hidden from the masses who had once adored her. She waited, minute after minute, dressed in the garments she had chosen herself, a gown of deep crimson, the colour of martyrs, and an English gable hood framing her face. When the guards finally arrived, she rose. The walk from her chamber to the scaffold was short no more than a few paces across the grass, but for her, it stretched longer than her entire life. Those who witnessed her said she moved with a quiet grace, almost floating, as though she were participating in a solemn ritual rather than walking toward death. On the low wooden platform, she gave her final speech. She did not curse Henry. She did not proclaim hatred or outrage. Instead, she praised him as a gentle and sovereign lord, accepted the judgment of the law, and prayed that God would protect him and grant him long life. She did not confess to any crime, yet she refused to challenge the sentence outright. Every word she spoke was shaped with one thought in mind. Elizabeth, her 3-year-old daughter, still living, still fragile, still entirely dependent on the king's mercy once her mother was gone. When she finished, she removed her hood. Her ladies stepped forward, hands trembling, to bind a blindfold around her eyes. The executioner brought from France at Henry's command was skilled with a sword rather than an axe. It was meant to be quicker, cleaner, a final gesture of mercy to the woman he was ending. He stood behind her and called out, "Bring me the sword!" though it was already in his hand. Instinctively, Anne turned her head toward the sound. In that small movement, her neck arched into the perfect position. A single stroke, swift, precise. Her head fell, and some said her lips were still forming a prayer. The spectators remained silent. No cheers, no triumph. Only the sound of Anne's ladies collapsing into grief as they gathered her body and head, wrapping them tenderly in cloth. There was no coffin suitable for a queen. No royal burial, no tolling bells. They placed her remains in a reused wooden chest and buried her in the chapel within the tower. That same day, Henry announced his engagement to Jane Seymour. 11 days later, he married her. 17 months after that, Jane died, giving Henry the son Anne had never been permitted to bring into the world. And the tragedy closed itself like a book, one written not because of any crime Anne committed, but because of a child who never drew breath, a boy whose death sealed his mother's fate, long before the sword ever touched her skin. After Anne Boleyn was executed, her story did not end. It slipped into another form, drifting through the years like a shadow that never quite settled, a dark legend, shaped not by truth, but by the hands of those who needed her memory twisted. Her enemies understood something essential. If they could stain her reputation after death, then her execution would seem justified, her replacement righteous, and the new order in England unquestionable. And so they began to rewrite her, not as a woman, but as a warning. One of the most enduring slanders was the tale of the monstrous child. Old books, careless films, and sensational novels have repeated it for centuries that the son Anne miscarried was a deformed mass, a sign that she was cursed by God or touched by dark forces. But the historical truth is stark, simple, and entirely different. Every contemporary source, including letters from the imperial ambassador Chapuis, who despised Anne deeply and never missed a chance to attack her, states plainly that the fetus was completely normal. It was described clearly as a male child of roughly 15 weeks. Not a single person living at the time mentioned deformity. Not a whisper, not a hint. The lie took root nearly 50 years later, planted by a man named Nicholas Sander, a Catholic propagandist determined to undermine Elizabeth I. His motive was transparent. If Anne, Elizabeth's mother, could be portrayed as a witch who produced a monster, then Elizabeth herself would appear illegitimate, unnatural, unfit to rule. With one accusation, he hoped to topple a dynasty. His fiction was repeated so often by those who wished it were true that it slid, quietly and poisonously, into the public imagination. Another slander, the claim that Anne had 6 fingers, is just as groundless. No Tudor document mentions it, no ambassador wrote of it, no courtier gossiped about it, no painter ever depicted it, and yet the rumour flourished, because it suited a narrative. A woman who had risen too quickly, who had fascinated a king, who had overturned kingdoms, surely she must have been strange, uncanny, marked. A 6th finger served that myth well. It made her seem less like a brilliant, educated, politically astute woman, and more like a creature crafted from suspicion and superstition. It comforted those who needed her downfall to make sense. A 3rd myth, still believed by many, is that Anne was accused or executed for witchcraft. But in the formal charges brought against her, every word of which has survived, not a single charge mentions sorcery, spells, or magic. She was condemned for adultery, incest, and treason. Nothing else. The idea of witchcraft entered her story through a single offhand comment attributed to Henry, that he sometimes felt bewitched by her. The word was metaphor, frustration, a lover's bitterness. But later writers, especially those hostile to the Tudor line, seized upon it eagerly. It allowed them to paint her as a seductress who had ensnared a king, not as a queen who had been destroyed by the cold machinery of power. Each of these distortions served the same political purpose: to make Anne responsible for her own death, to cloak the truth beneath layers of scandal and superstition. It was easier, far easier, to call her monstrous, deformed, or magical than to admit the simple, brutal reality. Anne Boleyn died because she did not give Henry a son. Everything else was window dressing. Everything else was a mask pulled over the face of a tragedy that England preferred not to confront. History is written by those who outlive their enemies. Anne did not live long enough to defend herself. And so the survivors, those who benefited from her ruin, told her story for her. They shaped it into something convenient, something useful, a shadow play, a warning, a lie that slipped through the centuries because it was dramatic, because it was damning, because it was easier to believe than the truth. But beneath all the distortions, beneath the myths layered like dust, the real woman still waits. A queen destroyed not by sin or sorcery, but by politics, fear, and the absence of a child who never had the chance to live. To understand why Anne was replaced with such astonishing speed, one must look closely at Jane Seymour, the woman Henry began to notice, while Anne was still very much alive. Jane was unlike Catherine, and unlike Anne. If Catherine had been steadfast, principled, and unshakably dignified, and if Anne had been sharp-minded, quick-witted, and unafraid to challenge a king, then Jane was something else entirely: silent, soft, pliant, and unfailingly obedient. And it was precisely that silence that Henry longed for after years of conflict, tension, and bruised pride. Jane presented herself not as a force to be reckoned with, but as a balm. She had served first Catherine, then Anne. She had watched both women, brilliant, strong, formidable, be broken under the weight of Henry's desires, Henry's disappointment, Henry's wrath. From these lessons, Jane absorbed something essential. Survival in the Tudor court did not come from strength. It came from yielding. If Henry could be made to believe she was the answer to his frustrations, then she might live where the others had fallen. So Jane crafted an image with exquisite care. When Henry sent her money and jewels, she refused them, unless others were present, an act that drove him into a near frenzy of admiration. The gesture spoke volumes without a single improper word. I am not Anne. I am not ambitious. I do not seek advantage. I do not demand. It was brilliantly executed. It gave Henry exactly what he wished to believe, that she was pure, untainted by desire for power, untouched by the ferocity Anne had carried like a torch. Outwardly, Jane appeared humble, almost passive, but beneath that quiet exterior lay an understanding sharper than most gave her credit for. Only the crown could protect her from sharing the fate of Catherine and Anne. In a court where a woman's safety depended entirely on the mood of the king, the throne was not a luxury. It was armor. After Anne's miscarriage in the month of January, Jane's rise became unstoppable. She was moved into prestigious private chambers. Her brothers grew suddenly influential. Titles, lands, and favors flowed toward the Seymour family like a river changing course. The message was unmistakable. Henry was preparing a replacement. Jane did not need grand schemes. Her mere existence, gentler than Anne, younger than Anne, and most importantly, not yet associated with failure, was enough for Henry to convince himself that a new marriage would bring him the blessing he believed God had denied him through Anne. All he needed was permission from his conscience, from the church he had bent into shape, from the courtiers eager to support the king's wishes. Jane, quiet and demure, was the perfect vessel for that permission. The speed was breathtaking. On the very day Anne died, Henry went to meet Jane. Only 11 days later, he married her. The ink was barely dry on Anne's death warrant. Elizabeth, Anne's daughter, was barely 3 years old. Yet Henry moved forward as though nothing had happened, as though he had been released from a long, uncomfortable dream. Jane understood her new role with absolute clarity. Her duty was singular, narrow, immovable, to give Henry a son. Nothing else mattered. Not politics, not affection, not her own health. And in the month of October in the year 1537, she succeeded. She delivered a healthy boy, Edward, who would become Edward VI. For Henry, this was the fulfillment of a hope that had tormented him for decades. It was the answer he believed heaven had withheld until that moment. His joy was overwhelming. His gratitude toward Jane bordered on reverence. But the cost was immense. Within a few days of childbirth, Jane fell ill with puerperal fever, an infection that swept through her weakened body with ruthless speed. She died not long after, leaving behind a newborn future king and a grieving husband who, for the rest of his life, would call her his true wife, his only virtuous queen, the one who had given him what no other woman had, a legitimate male heir. Jane's fate revealed something stark about life in the Tudor court. Silence might preserve a woman for a time. Obedience might delay danger. Sweetness might win affection. But none of these could protect her forever. The very role that shielded Jane was also the role that killed her. Yet in Henry's eyes, Jane remained perfect. The only queen who had accomplished the goal that overshadowed every marriage he forged. The only queen he chose to be buried beside. She, too, was a woman shaped by the same merciless world that had destroyed Catherine and Anne. But she learned to survive it until survival demanded more than her body could give. Thomas Cromwell was the man who lifted Anne Boleyn to the throne and the man who pulled her down from it. Born without title, without noble blood, without the armour of a great family name, Cromwell rose through the Tudor world using only what he possessed: a brilliant mind, a ruthless instinct, and an uncanny ability to feel the direction of political winds long before anyone else sensed the slightest shift. It was Cromwell who helped Henry set aside Catherine of Aragon. Cromwell who shattered the authority of the Catholic Church in England. Cromwell who orchestrated the dissolution of the monasteries and poured their vast wealth into the king's hands. Through him, a new England had been built harder, richer, and bound more tightly to the will of the crown. But such power came with enemies. Cromwell had no ancestors to shield him, no ancient lineage to protect his neck when the tides turned. The old nobility despised him for rising too high. Many clergy despised him for tearing down their world. And Anne, once his ally, began to clash with him publicly, criticizing his decisions, challenging his influence, threatening the balance he had so carefully constructed. After Anne's miscarriage in the month of January, when Henry's affection drifted openly toward Jane Seymour, Cromwell understood at once what the moment demanded. If he failed to free the king from this marriage, Anne, who now viewed him as an adversary, would destroy him the moment she recovered her footing. His choice was simple: act swiftly or be swept aside. So Cromwell began his work, not out of devotion, but out of survival. He gathered every rumour, every careless remark, every harmless moment from Anne's years at court. The laughter she shared with Norris, the friendly exchanges with Weston, a joke spoken lightly in a corridor, a conversation with Brereton. Moments so ordinary that no one had considered them meaningful. But under Cromwell's hand, they transformed. Threads spun into a net. Harmless gestures rewritten into illicit affection. Words rearranged into evidence. He needed only one weak link to force the door open, and he found it. Mark Smeaton, a poor musician with no powerful family, no allies, no shield. Whether through threat, pain, or the sheer terror of being interrogated by the king's most feared minister, Smeaton confessed. That single statement was the key Cromwell needed. Once it clicked into place, everything else toppled like a line of dominoes. Norris was arrested, Weston, Brereton, and finally George Boleyn himself, the brilliant, eloquent brother who had always stood at Anne's side. With each arrest, the image sharpened not of truth, but of a narrative. A queen unfaithful, a brother complicit, courtiers corrupted, a conspiracy blooming in shadow. The indictment Cromwell crafted was thick with invented details, dates that contradicted known records, and accusations that collapsed under the slightest scrutiny. But Henry did not want proof. He wanted release. He wanted a reason he could present to God and to England, a justification that allowed him to marry Jane Seymour without the stain of simple abandonment. And Cromwell delivered it with chilling efficiency. Anne died because Cromwell built the blueprint of her destruction, and Henry accepted it gratefully. Yet 4 years later, the wheel turned again. In the year 1540, Henry wished to rid himself of his fourth wife, Anne of Cleves. The marriage, arranged by Cromwell himself, had displeased the king from the moment he first saw her. Now Henry sought a way out, and he turned his gaze upon the very architect who had once executed his wishes so perfectly. Suddenly, Cromwell found himself in the place where Anne had stood, accused with vague charges, surrounded by enemies he had made in his rise, denied time to prepare a defence, dragged through a rapid trial designed only to confirm the king's will. He had written this script before. Now he was forced to read from it. When he climbed the scaffold on Tower Hill, perhaps he thought of Anne, of how swiftly her world had collapsed, of how coldly he himself had arranged it. Perhaps he understood, in that final hour, that in the Tudor court, traps never stayed empty. The person who built them would always be the next to fall. He had risen through brilliance. He fell through the same blade he once sharpened for another. And as the axe descended, the truth of Tudor England revealed itself once more. Power did not protect. Success did not guarantee safety. In the shadow of Henry VIII, even the most formidable men lived only at the king's mercy. Cromwell had been executioner, strategist, architect of political storms. But in the end, he was simply the next victim. Though Anne Boleyn was killed under charges that were never real, she left behind a legacy no executioner, no propaganda, no king could erase. Elizabeth I, her daughter, her only surviving child, who would grow into one of the greatest monarchs England ever knew. There is a bitter irony threaded through this truth. The child Henry dismissed as unworthy, the daughter he considered a disappointment because she was not a son, became the only one of his children to rule long, steadily, and brilliantly. The son he tore England apart for Edward VI would rule only a few short years. Mary, his daughter by Catherine of Aragon, would struggle through a reign shaped by turmoil and grief. But Elizabeth, the daughter of the woman he destroyed, would preside over decades of stability and cultural flowering. It is as though history itself reached back to correct him. Elizabeth embodied much of Anne's spirit. Her sharp intelligence, her political intuition, her independent mind, her ability to charm and intimidate in equal measure. These were the same qualities that had made Anne dazzling and dangerous in the role of queen consort. But when housed in a queen regnant, they became a source of strength. The world that condemned Anne for ambition celebrated Elizabeth for wisdom. And in this strange transformation is the outline of Anne's vindication. Yet the centuries after Anne's death were not kind to her memory. Her image was pulled apart and reshaped whenever politics demanded it. Catholic writers painted her as a temptress, a sorceress, a devourer of men's virtue. Protestant writers, eager to defend Elizabeth's right to rule, recast Anne as a martyr, a holy victim crushed by a tyrant. Playwrights and novelists later turned her into something else again. Sometimes a seductress, sometimes a schemer, sometimes a romantic heroine, sometimes a villain. She became a mirror, reflecting whatever story the writer needed. It was only in the modern era, when historians began piecing together primary sources one by one, Chapuis's letters, Cromwell's papers, court records, treasury accounts, eyewitness notes, that the fog began to lift. Line by line, document by document, the myths around Anne dissolved. What remained was not a witch, not a martyr, not a monster, not a saint. What remained was a woman. A woman brilliant enough to reshape a king's court. A woman strategic enough to survive years of political storms. A woman ambitious enough to demand respect in a world where few women dared. But most of all, a woman trapped inside a system that demanded something she alone could not guarantee: a healthy male heir. In Tudor England, a queen's life depended not on her loyalty, or her virtue, or her intelligence, but on whether her womb produced the right child. Anne did not fail because of moral flaws or political sins. She failed because biology did not cooperate, and because Henry's heart, so quick to ignite, was just as quick to cool. He loved her fiercely, until he didn't. And once he stopped, her fate was sealed. In our time, Anne has become a symbol of the countless women crushed beneath the weight of absolute male power. A reminder that brilliance can be punished, that independence can be misread as defiance, that voices too bold can be silenced. Her story warns how easily lies can survive when truth is inconvenient, how gossip can outlive justice, how history can be bent by those who hold the pen. But her story also shows something else, something quieter, slower, gentler. Lies can last centuries, but truth has its own strange persistence. It rises, grain by grain, through the soil of time. It waits. And perhaps the most painful part of Anne's legacy is not her execution, nor the slanders that followed, nor the centuries of misunderstanding. The deepest sorrow lies in the fact that she never lived to see Elizabeth grow. She never saw the child she fought for become the woman who would restore her name. She never learned that the daughter dismissed as unwanted would prove, beyond any measure, that Anne Boleyn had been worth far more than the world allowed her to be. The mother died in darkness, but the daughter carried her into the light. When we look back at the tragedy of the year 1536, the most haunting realization is this. Everything began with a single moment: Henry's fall during the joust. One slip of a horse, one crash of armor striking frozen ground, one breath in which the king lay still as death, and the entire kingdom shuddered. That moment sent fear rippling through every corridor of power. It sent shock through Anne's body so violently that she miscarried. And it ended the life of the little boy, the last fragile thread tying her future to Henry's hopes. From the instant that tiny body was wrapped in a white cloth and carried away, Anne's fate was sealed. In Tudor society, no matter how brilliant a woman was, no matter how influential, no matter how beloved or feared, her true worth was measured by only one thing: her ability to give birth to a healthy son. Every other quality, wit, intelligence, political acumen, charm, was a decoration, not a shield. And when that one measure failed, the world collapsed with chilling speed. Anne had entered her marriage with Henry in blinding radiance. He had torn down the authority of the church. He had defied the Pope, infuriated kingdoms, and risked war across Europe, all to have her. She had once been the woman he swore he could not live without. But that same intensity of love became the blade that would one day destroy her. Because when Henry changed his heart, everything he had once admired became a burden, a flaw, an irritation he sought to escape. And so Anne's tragedy became a reflection of a deeper, older tragedy, the tragedy of countless women throughout history. Women whose intelligence was dismissed, whose strength was unwelcome, whose value was tethered to the workings of their own bodies, something they could never fully command. A single failed pregnancy could outweigh years of loyalty, brilliance, or sacrifice. A single lost child could cost a woman her crown, her safety, or her life. Anne died because she could not give Henry what he believed heaven owed him. Her unborn son gasped for no breath, yet his absence changed the fate of a queen. And the swiftness with which she was replaced, Jane Seymour ushered into royal favour, even before Anne's body had grown cold, revealed a truth so harsh it almost feels ancient. Once a woman lost her political or biological usefulness, the system cast her aside with the same speed it once raised her up. But even in that darkness, a glimmer of light remained. Elizabeth I, Anne's daughter, the child Henry had deemed unworthy simply because she was a girl, would grow into a monarch whose legacy eclipsed the achievements of every man in Anne's lifetime. She would rule for nearly half a century, shaping England into a cultural and political force that resonated far beyond her era. Her survival, her triumph, her brilliance became a testimony stronger than any apology, any monument, any written vindication. Elizabeth's reign proved something that no execution, no lie, no courtroom accusation could erase. The true value of Anne Boleyn could not be severed by a sword. In the end, Anne's story is not merely a historical tragedy, it is a warning whispered across centuries. It reminds us that power can bend justice until it breaks, that lies, if repeated by enough voices, can sharpen into weapons, that silence from those who know the truth can carry the weight of complicity. It tells us that innocence does not always protect, and that the machinery of a kingdom can crush even its brightest figures without hesitation. Yet that same history offers a final, quiet assurance. Truth may be buried, but never forever. It may sleep beneath the noise of rumor, beneath centuries of propaganda and slander, beneath books and plays and whispered tales, but eventually it rises. It always rises. And when it does, it reveals what Anne herself never lived to see, that her worth, her legacy, and her daughter's glory stretched far beyond the reach of any blade.